For today's video, we're going to be taking a look at how are we to parent various age groups. Today, we're going to take a look at 0 to 5 and a special focus that we want to have in mind when we begin parenting the littlest of our children, so the youngest of our children. We're going to be talking a lot about authority. At this age, this stage of the game, 0 to 5, we want to establish that our children are always going to be under some authority. And the blessing of finding out from the scriptures is that this is all established by God. Ultimately, we want our children to understand they will always live under authority, especially God's authority. And in this authority, they'll always be safe. They'll always be safe. Outside of that authority, well, that's the loss of life. It really is. So we'll be addressing that. Maybe to start off with our discussion in this regard, I want to read to you proof from the scriptures about all of us living under authority. It's a fourth commandment issue, especially directed at children. So Ephesians 6, 1 to 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may have long life on the earth. And then, in addition to that, we hear this command, fathers, then do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. You see from that passage, children, it is God's desire, it is his will, it is his command that they submit, that they obey fathers and mothers. And there's good reason for this. This authority that's over them has been established so that these children might live long lives, so that they don't fall victim to the consequences of rebellion, living outside of authority. And of course, this commandment doesn't just apply to children in regard to their parents, but the extension of this, we are all under the authority of the church and of the government. These are established by God too. They fall under the umbrella of the fourth commandment. So it's really critical, and we'll be talking a little bit about this in this video, why it's imperative for our children to understand that. And I say that with some emphasis today because in our world today, in our culture today, we encourage rebelling against authority. Perhaps this has been going on since the 1960s, even shortly after World War II. In some way, it's always been lurking in the human heart, the sinful nature, because the act of the first sin of the devil was a rebellion against God's authority. And when the devil came to tempt us in Genesis 3 in the garden, what was he ultimately tempting us about? Rebelling against God's established authority, suggesting that there might be a better life outside of that authority. When the truth of the matter is there's only death and heartache and brokenness and pain and suffering, all the consequences of sin. They all really stem back to rebelling against authority. So in this culture that we live in, this is an uphill battle for us in many respects because we are demanding that no one is above anyone else. Well, if children believe that, death will be their teacher. One of the Proverbs even says that. But for now, let's consider this. When a child learns to live within the circle of authority, of God's loving authority that he designed, they generally will be safe, right? Their whole long life, this is the first commandment with a promise. You can see God's intent. God is not establishing authority over us to make us suffer. That's a lie of the devil. God isn't establishing authority over us so that he can lord it over us. No, he understands that we need him to be over us because in him, in this circle of authority, again, there's life. And he understands and recognizes that in this world, we also need human authorities that have been established over us for the sake of order and well-being and life. The greatest of authorities, if you will, begins in the family. Fathers and mothers for the sake of children, to raise up good people, to be pillars in our society, church and government. So this is a really critical issue. It is imperative that we teach our children to respect, honor, and obey authority. This depends on their life. that they do these things. They'll most certainly live forever in God's presence if they live in the circle of his authority, right? Through the gospel. And that's the ultimate goal. That's why it's so good that he has authority over all things, because in that authority, what does he do? He delivers us the gospel. So with that, we need to address then our children's tendency. We talked about this in the previous video. Because of their darkened hearts, because of their sinful nature, their absolute depravity of their flesh, and we have the same thing, the same battle. We need to help them fight against this natural autonomy, this natural idea that they have. And when I say natural, I mean natural for the sinful nature. This idea that they are independent of all things, even God, as if you could live apart from God. But by nature, we like to believe that. And children are born with hearts full of folly. So their hearts are bound up in this thought that they can be independent. We see it with a toddler who doesn't want any help, doesn't need mom and dad to tell them this or that. We see it when they rebel, when they throw a temper tantrum or whatever, right? That's all an issue of authority displayed in their rebellious attitude as they try to exercise complete autonomy. Of course, what flows out of that is this idea that they're self-sufficient. You try to help a child tie their shoelaces, and a lot of times they'll slap your hand because they can do it on their own. They don't need you to hold their hand. They don't need, go on down the line, right? And as they get older and further themselves along into life, they still struggle with this into adulthood. They just might become more sophisticated in hiding these things. So we really want to address this between the ages of 0 and 5. How do we do that? Well, we become aware of the issue, for starters. So living in the circle of God's authority, honoring fathers and mothers, here's some of the terminology or some of the attitude, some of the actions that you'll find when your child is struggling to live under authority. Now, without God's guidance from the scriptures, we might just overlook these things, thinking, well, they're so common. What's the harm? And yeah, I would prefer that my child doesn't say those things or act like that, but what am I going to do? Children will be children. It's not the case. We really need to examine and help our children pull off the blinders so they see in their heart this perverse idea that authority is all bad and it's only trying to keep us down, that we're autonomous and sufficient on our own. If you ever had someone, a child say this to you, fine, mom, I'll do it, but it's not fair that I have to do this. That's a sign that they're rebelling against authority. Or if they're not just challenging, but if they have without an excuse, Dad, I didn't hear you. So you've told them that they needed to do something, and then they pull the whole, I didn't hear you. Did you want me to do all the dishes? I'm sorry, I was distracted. That's rebellion against authority, isn't it? And it's trying to become more sophisticated in excusing themselves. So when you see a challenge against authority, Mom, this isn't fair. When you see an excuse, I didn't hear you. When you see a delay and not just quickly obeying, submitting. When, a child says, Mom, well, you never said when. That's rebellion against authority. Those are all examples. So just being mindful of how children often respond to our authority. Know this, their instinct, because of their hearts, is to reject and fight against that authority. We want to take moments in conversations with them to point out what's really going on. With that, we want to make sure that children don't just obey their parents with a good attitude, with a right heart, but we want to make sure that they honor, that they respect parents because of the position of authority. And I think a lot of parents wrestle with this too, especially on the bad days, or they kind of overlook it and they feel like, I've made so many mistakes as a father, as a mother. I'm not going to necessarily demand my children will respect me or show respect like they used to do in generations past. And granted, maybe in generations past, they were overbearing. They exasperated children because they didn't explain why they should exercise authority over their children. We maybe hated the idea of whenever our parents said, well, you're going to do this because I told you so, because I'm your dad and that's it. Well, we don't like to hear that because we don't understand the wisdom behind the authority. And actually, I guess you could argue that's kind of an abuse of authority. No one person inherently has authority over another. But the authority that we do bear, that's been established by God and for good purposes. So we need to make it clear that we are deserving of respect, not because we've earned or deserved it, but because parents have been given authority by God. Same with the church. Same with government rulers. So children should never address adults as their peers, especially not father or mother. If you have a child addressing you by your first name, that is inappropriate. Why? Because they're rivaling your authority, and that's not healthy for them. I know we've fallen into a practice where we often invite children to now call us by our first names. I would argue that that's just terribly unwise. I would even say it disgraces or despises the authority that God has established in parents and in those who have authority over others. It is a healthy thing to recognize there's authority and it's for good reason. So children should not treat parents like peers. And if we're falling into a tendency where we're seeing our children as our best friends, there's an issue there. You are not their best friend. You are their parent. I think there's often an overreaction. We don't want to be authoritarian in our parenting approaches, but we don't want to just be a pushover and try to be their buddy and never hurt their feelings either. We don't have that luxury. They need us to be authoritative. That's a good thing. So really think through that and see if we're falling into a trap one way or the other, where maybe we're being overbearing and we're exercising our authority without loving explanation, speaking to how this is God's authority, or we've gone to the other way, the pendulum swung, and we want our children to see us as peers because, well, we don't want to be seen as authoritarian. We don't want to be seen as authoritarian, but we do have authority. Children should not give you commands. That's inexcusable. You can say, child of mine, of course, call them by name, go and do your chores. If they should ever say, hey, mom, get me some milk, that is completely despising the authority. There is a difference. They should always learn to say, please, mom, may I have some milk? Out of respect for the authority that they need to recognize. It's for their good. So hopefully you understand too, this isn't just a soapbox that I'm on, but this is really for their life. If they live outside of authority, they will die. Eternally so if they live outside of God's authority. And if they can't respect human authority, they're not going to respect God's authority, whom they can't see. So maybe some thoughts for you to consider as we kind of round out this first side of this issue. What we do for ages 0 to 5, we really emphasize how they live under authority for their blessing, and we paint a beautiful picture of that authority. Maybe you could discuss what blessings will an adult experience if, as a child, they learn that they are always under authority. So I want you to think about your child when they're an adult. What blessings will they experience if from early on they respect authority? And they were taught to obey and honor such authorities of God. And they recognize it's from God. And they're motivated entirely by the gospel. So that's the key here. We'll talk a little bit about this under discipline. Discipline is really reserved for the times when children rebel against authority. They want to be driven by the gospel. That's what we're looking for. That's what God wants for them. And in that, they'll truly respect and see the beautiful nature of authority. And they'll also be able to handle those in authority who are bad servants of God, leaving it to God to avenge. Talk about that again more in depth under discipline in our next video. Maybe you could take some time and give examples then if you're talking with your spouse or even in front of your children. Talk about examples of when a child's own sense of autonomy, independence, or self-sufficiency was a cause for their rejecting your authority as a parent. Explain how these are attacks on God's authority and his gospel. It's a good exercise because in articulating this that will just reinforce your growing awareness of whenever your children reject your authority. If we can see that this authority comes from God, this authority is a blessing, this authority comes to give them life, then we're going to be hypersensitive to it, which is a good thing. And we'll lovingly be able to draw this out of our children, crucify it in the waters of baptism, forgive them, and point out what the new self can live by under authority. More on this as we address that rebellious nature in our children, especially in those moments when they reject authority. We'll be talking again about dealing with this for ages 0 to 5. We'll see you in our next video.